Welcome to the very first episode of the Political Marketing Podcast with me, Benedict Pringle. This is a podcast that seeks to understand how election candidates, political parties and campaigning organisations win hearts, minds and even votes. I'll be talking to strategists, creatives, consultants, academics, special advisors and insiders working at the sharp end of political marketing. So from this series, you can expect thoughtful conversation about what works, what doesn't, and what's changing in the world of political marketing. So whether you're a campaign pro, a marketing geek, perhaps you're just politically curious, this podcast offers a unique view on the machinery of political persuasion. This podcast is brand new, as I say, so please help me battle the algorithms of discovery by subscribing, reviewing and sharing on your socials. So to kick things off, I'm joined by someone who has helped shape the entire discipline of political marketing. Professor Jennifer Lees-Marshment is one of the world's leading thinkers on political marketing and management. She's written and edited a vast array of books on the topic, and her work has helped define how we understand the intersection of politics, strategy, and communication. Jennifer is the editor of a brand new book, Political Marketing and Management in the 2024 UK election, which I'm very proud to have contributed a chapter to. And Jennifer is also a political marketing and management professor at the University of Dundee. So welcome to the show, Jennifer. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's very exciting that you're doing this podcast.
This episode is being recorded almost exactly a year on from the 2024 general election. And it's that anniversary, really, which sort of drove us to schedule this conversation. The heat has cooled on the analysis of the 2024 general election, although not literally the heat, because we're recording on an absolutely boiling hot day. But with that distance from the general election, I think we can assess things with a bit more clarity. In the book, Jennifer, you open it up with an introduction where you say, on the surface, the UK 2024 election was a relatively simple story of a Labour landslide over a Conservative incumbent who had been in government for a long time. But underneath it, there was far more complexity. And I'm hoping in this conversation we can unpack what political marketing really means, how the 2024 campaigns were run, and what lessons we can draw for the future from the 2024 election. But before we dive into all that, I would love to start right at the beginning, I guess, and sort of talk about what exactly is political marketing. How did it emerge as a discipline, and what drew you to it?
What drew me to it, to start with that question, was Tony Blair and how he changed the Labour Party so much back in 1995 to 1997 and did all that to make it electable. But in doing so, hurt and upset some very loyal traditional Labour voters. And I was like, what's going on here? Why do they feel the need to do that? And of course, they had lost multiple elections, so they needed to change. But what we found was they were using political marketing to help them decide how to change. And it wasn't just the comms and the spin and the adverts, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of political marketing. But instead, it was changing actual policies and informing leadership decisions, because they had done market research, just like you would for advertising and business product development, and realised they needed to change what they had on offer. But I just thought this was a big dilemma in terms of parties needing to research and understand voters and use marketing in that sense, but then possibly losing their ideals and sense of mission and sense of purpose in doing so. And so I spent the last 25 years trying to do more and more research on it to uncover basically how do political parties and politicians use tools of marketing from the business world in the environment of politics and government, and what impact does that have on us and our daily lives.
That's fascinating and brilliant to hear that, the 1997 election is what drew you to the discipline, and now here we are all those years later, and Labour coming in with
Labour victory,
yes, another stonking majority. And I guess I'm interested, like how natural a parallel can you draw between the way in which businesses approach marketing and the way that political parties and candidates approach marketing?
There, I mean, there's similarities in that they use the same tools, but they probably use it in different ways and it has different impact. So they do have to adjust them slightly. The political product is way more complex. The political leader, the politician, the person that they are, their background becomes a way bigger part of the product than, say, the CEO does of a business, with some exceptions in business. But generally speaking, people look at the product, they don't really know who are the people behind it. So the people part of the product is very, very different. It's also much harder to deliver the political product. And this is where the Conservatives went wrong and possibly where Labour will go wrong and other parties in the UK, because they're not being able to deliver on their key promises. So it's not just informing what promises they make, but it has an impact on whether or not they can deliver them and what voters think of them when they don't deliver. So it's a lot more complex. So you can use the same tools from business to politics, but it's a lot more complex. And of course, there's things like ideology, and then there's the party. And yes, in business, you have stakeholders, but the political party and the members and the fellow politicians, they all want to take your job if you're the leader of the party, even if you're prime minister. And so as soon as sales go down, as soon as the votes go down, or rather the opinion polls go down, they start trying to change who's at the top, and then it just creates more instability. So it's just a lot more complex. And of course, you're also running the country, right? Parties are either running the country or proposing to run the country if they're a major party. So that you're affecting millions, way more people than you do if you're a business. So if you think of Trump, the businessman, and how many people he affected, and yeah, there were some people there, of course, and then how many he's affecting as president, that probably gives you the clearest indication, because it's not even just all the people in the United States, it's people in Canada, people in the UK, Ukraine, and so on, as he starts to have foreign relations influence. So yeah, it's huge, much more
Yeah.
complex activity.
Yeah, hugely more complex, and it's interesting hearing you touch on the impact of potential leader change on marketing, and we're going to come on and talk about that a little bit later in the show. So we'll come back to that. Um, just before we move on to the 24 general election, just one more sort of general topic I would keen to cover with you, which is you created a concept of market orientation in political marketing, which I think is a really core concept and has helped my understanding of political marketing hugely. Could you explain the concept of market orientation?
Yeah, I mean, in the simplest form, it's that political parties and politicians should make sure that they research and understand what voters want and need, and then they should create a product that will satisfy those wants and needs. And I emphasize wants and needs because it's not just what they want, say low tax, but it's also what they need, which might be sometimes higher tax in order to fund climate change initiatives, for example, or bringing in services or regulations that restrict their behaviour for the public good. So it's a complex thing, even when you say it that simply. Also, it's not just about making them happy, it's about satisfying them. So that's where there's a short versus long term aspect to politics and political marketing, because you're supposed to satisfy their needs and do things which may not be what they want at first, but actually are going to help society as a whole and ultimately help their daily lives. And also to satisfy the consumer, in this case the voter, you need to produce policies and deliver on those policies so that they actually do have a positive impact on people's daily lives. And one of the challenges I think that we're seeing at the moment in the UK, and we saw this in the election and through the book, is that possibly politicians are failing to do that. They're not really satisfying voters over the long term. They're being more pandering and more tactical and appealing perhaps to their short-term superficial wants rather than their deep long-term needs.
That's fascinating, and leads us very neatly on to my next question around how market orientated was the Labour Party in the lead up to the general election? Were they, as you say, focused on the short term wants rather than the long term needs? How would you assess their market orientation?
That's a good question. It's a complex answer. So up until about a year before the election, they were fairly highly market oriented. They'd done a lot of research, they'd done a lot of listening, developing 5 missions for the country. These broadly aligned with people's top concerns. They were talking about taking a long-term approach to government, that they weren't going to give the people gimmicks and so on, but it was going to be serious things that were going to get the country into a better position and doing better. But then the problem is that what the market wanted changed the year before the election, and suddenly immigration was rising up on the agenda, and Labour weren't quick enough to adapt to that. And this is something we're seeing around the world, because what voters want is tend to be more volatile at the moment. Since 2020 in particular, there's seemed to be a lot more volatility, where parties will get elected or build up support or design a product to suit voters' wants, and then they change, and the needs change. So in that respect, they didn't manage to satisfy voters. Immigration. The other thing is, and this is a stark contrast compared to 1997 with Tony Blair, in that all of the indicators of voter perception about Labour and about the Labour leader Keir Starmer were that, okay, they rated them more highly than the UK Conservatives and the Conservative Party, who were in all sorts of problems, as we will no doubt discuss next. But they didn't rate Labour that highly. So it's normally an incoming party who's, redesigned the product and rebranded themselves and positioned and created a solid relationship with voters, come into power. Normally, they come in riding high, and they need that because they need room to go down, because that inevitably they will go down in public support, as they sometimes have to make all the decisions and suddenly responsible for everything. And they didn't. The opinion polls were really low, so it was a very weak win in my view, even though the numbers indicate otherwise. The strength of support, the strength of hope that voters had was very low. They didn't really believe the Labour Party could solve their top concerns. And so it was really, in that respect, if you look in terms of satisfaction rather than just votes, look at how satisfied were voters with the product they were promised. It was very poor satisfaction. Yes, maybe they thought it was better than Conservatives overall, but on the whole, it was actually not wanted that much, or not believed. And then the other weird thing that they did, which added salt to injury, if you like, which made things worse, was in the campaign, they didn't talk about their priorities. They talked about change. But anytime they were asked, well, what is that change going to be? What are you going to do specifically? They would talk about the Conservatives and try and change the subject. So they haven't really got a mandate or, a bulk of support behind what they're trying to do. And that makes things very difficult going forward.
Yeah. And I guess we can feel a bit of that, a year into into government.
Yeah.
Continuing on Labour, in my chapter in the book, I showed that Labour had quite a tricky conversion problem, where they had a huge number of people considering voting for them, about 70% of people in the UK, which is a massive number. But they went on to convert, less than half of those people. Their total percentage of the vote was around 34%. So a sort of 50% drop off in conversion from considered to and ended up voting, and that was a much poorer conversion rate than the Conservatives. The Conservatives had about a 10% better conversion rate than Labour. And I wondered, in another section of the book, there is discussion around the fact that Labour's policies were very broadly market oriented. So they appealed to sort of the top line view of the majority of people, but they didn't have policies which spoke deeply to particular segments. Now, from what you were saying, it seems as if they didn't speak enough about policy in general.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you thought that was a shortcoming in their approach, which is they focused their offering too broadly, and in fact, they should have been a little more segmented, and that might have helped with their conversion.
Because we generally say that they should start with their own voters and move out or move to the centre. So they have elements of the product that will appeal to their more solid voters, as well as elements that will appeal to voters from the other side. So, in 1997, Tony Blair appealed to middle class voters who were aspiring and wanted to get ahead. And Thatcher actually did the same as a Conservative, but she was appealing, probably to more working class voters who wanted to get ahead. They kind of switch segments, if you like, and appeal to some segments of voters from the other side. And that is always more successful. And normally they do it with, distinct policies that people can talk about and speak about. I'm not sure if you asked people on the street if they would know what Labour's key policies are. So, the missions were broad. They did have specifics and detail behind them, but again, Labour didn't talk about them much in their mainstream communication. But there was also just nothing in particular that was. There was Great British Rail, I suppose, but there's nothing that they particularly were the flagship policies that would get attention. And they made this worse by their campaign communication, where it was just like, well, we're going to change. The other key thing they did was a lot of negative communication and a lot of negative marketing, where they talked about the problems of the Conservatives. And I think, whilst, yes, I'm not denying there were problems with the Conservatives, the voters already knew that. They didn't need to go on about it. What voters were looking for was an alternative. And instead, they kept talking about the Conservatives and saying, therefore, that's why people should vote Labour. But in a way, it undermined the whole brand of politics. And I think that's why voters didn't have much hope that Labour would make much of a difference, because they weren't talking enough in specific terms about what they were going to do differently. And some of it was also fairly standard and fairly inane, the sort of stuff you've heard from politicians over the last 20, 30 years, where, for example, Starmer talked about growth. And it's like, well, is growth really still the answer? What's distinctive about what's new? And they really do need some new ideas. They need some better product design, some better policy design. Maybe it will come out in the course of the government, but it's rare. Normally, the first few years is the time to do the innovative stuff.
Sticking with the topic of Conservative collapse, let's move on to the Tories. And you've touched already on the 2024 election being in the context of a complex voter landscape and an incredibly volatile voter mindset. I wondered if you could talk about some of the things that might have contributed to that volatility as a first point, and then as a second point, did that context affect the Conservatives more negatively because they were incumbent?
Obviously, if you're the incumbent, you get blamed for what's happened. So there's that. But then there's two key things that the Conservatives did that actually were their own fault and weren't really because of volatility. So the first thing was changing leader all the time. If you change leaders multiple times, you lose your reputation for good economic governance. And also, if you can't run your own team, how can you run a government? It also meant, because they were quite strong personalities, so it meant, and this is something that Robert Busby talks about in the book, it meant that their brand relationship and the brand differentiation was very confused. People didn't really know what was what with the Conservatives. But then the key thing was, and this pertains to Labour a bit as well, is that they made very specific promises under Rishi Sunak, the last Conservative Prime Minister and party leader, to do very specific things. One of them was to reduce the boats, for example, stop the boats or reduce the numbers of illegal immigrants coming to the country. And they didn't deliver on that. And ultimately, if you have very clear product promises and you don't deliver on them, people are not going to, they're not going to have much faith in you. And that's the key thing. They didn't really make a difference to people's lives. And then, of course, there was the cost of living issue that happened after COVID. And then you've got the overall reputation of the damages caused by Boris Johnson. And then possibly voters beginning to reflect as well on their choices in the Brexit referendum and what that meant for them. So, the bottom line is, though, there are lots of issues and we've highlighted some of them. But the bottom line is they didn't deliver the promised product. And so then you just lose credibility. And they didn't spend, a bit like Labour really, they didn't spend much time talking about their new promises in the campaign either. Not that the campaign is the most important, but it is the last chance to show off what it is you're promising to do. And if you can't do that, if you can't articulate it, and you don't have anything that's distinctive, then particularly for a long-term government, you've got very little chance of winning an election. So they made multiple mistakes. But in terms of volatility, the immigration, yes, it would have affected the Conservatives too, but they were in charge and they were supposed to do something about it, and they did acknowledge it much more than Labour, and they promised they would, and they didn't actually achieve it. And it's a big, big issue for this country. It's an issue that's going around the world. It possibly relates to deeper things such as voters' sense of insecurity, not feeling well off, feeling under threat in some way, not feeling secure, and the ladder of opportunity being broken. So, of course, that will have hit the Conservatives, just as I think it also possibly hit Labour, albeit in a more indirect way for Labour.
This interplay between the personal brand of the party leader and the brand of the party, and needing to find a sort of a level of synergy so that you can sort of reach more voters than you would separately, I thought was a really interesting aspect, and it makes completely intuitive sense. And with all the coverage at the moment of whether or not the Conservatives are going to stick with Kemi Badenoch or not, it does make me lean towards the fact that you're better off sticking with a brand and trying to sort of bring together some sort of synergy than constantly changing it, because the moment you change it, you go back to square one, and you have to start rebuilding again. And if you change it too often, just no one knows what you're standing for. It seems like that was an element of the failure, as you say, in the Conservatives campaign. I wondered, given the failure of delivery, which, as you say, was at the core of the Conservatives' reason for collapse, could better marketing have made a difference, do you think? Or were they always on for a shoeing?
That's a really difficult question. Could better marketing have made a difference? I mean, marketing might have urged them to be very careful about what they promised. It might have urged for them to, yeah, be a bit more cautious with that. But other than that, this comes down to government. And I'm not sure marketing can solve the problem of government's failure to deliver. It really can't, because that's about actually getting the job done and making sure the product works. So I mean, it can inform policy a bit in the promises and make sure, we always say be achievable, don't promise the earth, because that's not going to work. But I don't think it could have solved that problem.
It's
Maybe by setting progress points, maybe by some delivery communication to show progress. But the problem is they didn't really make much progress. I mean, this is a major issue in people's daily lives in some cases, because it's affecting them where they live. So it needs to be dealt with. They did try to do the Rwanda plan. Maybe they've got that working, but again, would that come down to marketing? Probably more political management than anything. I would have thought, managing stuff within the parliament to try and get that solution. But they just took a really long time to do things.
let's continue on that theme of management, because you also write about political management as well as political marketing. And I think that seems to me to be a very new field, which again you're leading the charge on. Um, you in the book you reference sort of the management and role of special advisors in the UK, and I wondered if you could give us a view on what you think of the process by which we as a country recruit and manage our special advisors, and how big a role do they play in the management of the country?
Yeah. I mean, special advisors are an extension of politicians, so it's not like they're supplanting them. But at the same time, they do have a significant role to play in helping politicians, particularly ministers, do a good job. So they are important to running the country. They are important to getting things done. They are the people who will help, for example, remind the ministers of what the public are thinking, where they're at, what their experiences are. They'll also advise them on how to get, their policies through and legislation through Parliament, as well as helping to manage communication so that they can maintain enough support to be able to exercise leadership. In terms of the recruitment and management and training, it's pretty abysmal, and this is true the world over. There are some initiatives happening in certain places to try and make things better, and I know there's work being done in the UK at the moment to try and improve things, and individuals are very pioneering. Some individuals are very pioneering and try and make things better. But of course, by the time they're kind of sorting it out, the politician they're working for, the leader or the party, gets deselected or unelected, and then the new party comes in and has to start all over again. Generally speaking, advisors and politicians, for that matter, are not managed well. They're not given clear orientation. There isn't clear training. There's not clear performance reviews. They aren't given enough support. Their well-being is completely dismissed. I know ordinary people listening to this will think of Partygate and think, well, they were fine, and actually they were breaking lockdown rules. But what probably is behind that is the fact that they're working excruciatingly long hours. There's nowhere to eat properly at Downing Street. There's no well-being support. They're treated very much as second-class citizens. They don't get the same rights as civil servants, even though the SPADs are technically a civil servant. And so when you get a situation with any group of people, any group of professionals, if you put them in those kind of workplace conditions, where it's excruciatingly long hours, the pressure is incredibly high, there's no training, there's no orientation, there's no well-being support, there's no feedback, most of them, most people wouldn't do particularly well under those circumstances. I'm not using this excuse for problematic behaviour, of course. I'm just saying partly it's a cause behind it. And if we look at it more positively, if we want to get the best out of our politicians and their staff, we need to be training them properly. We train hairdressers, we train builders, as well as lawyers and doctors. Why shouldn't we train those people who are making the biggest decisions affecting millions of people around the world? And why shouldn't we make sure that they're supported to be healthy, both physically and mentally, so they can make the best decisions? So this is an area of a big potential, an area that needs a lot of reform. But it's very difficult to do, because if a politician stands up and says, I think we need more support, he'll either be criticised for, he or she will be criticised for not being able to do the job properly and why they're doing that job if they don't know how to do it, or being self-seeking and self-interested. So it really needs a cross-party reform initiatives, as well as the civil service helping. Even though they're supposed to be neutral, they still need to help this group of actors. And so there are reforms around the world, but it's stop, start, stop, start. It is very, very ad hoc, and it's a real shame.
I think it's such important work you're doing on this because you know, people going into politics and staying in it and doing it for the right reasons and having successful and happy long-standing careers, in my view, will make the country so much better run.
Absolutely.
And you know, if we've got a sort of a rot at the core of it, where our processes for recruitment, training, management, career development, if none of that is working, I think the hope of us being able to improve our capability of delivery, which, as you say, is the fundamental bedrock for what campaigns are ultimately built on. Yeah, it's sort of
Absolutely.
it's a marketing problem, it's a delivery problem, it's everything. So
It is. I mean, I
yeah,
spoke to a client, an advisor who worked for a climate change minister in New Zealand, and they were working on really important, zero carbon climate change legislation. But they said they came in and they said, right, okay, what do I do? And everybody said, oh, you'll just figure it out. By the end of the process, they'd figured out how to do things, how to manage the communication internally to get things through, how to figure out what to compromise on, whatever. But it would have been so much better if they knew right at the beginning, right? And it's crazy that everybody has to learn on the job, particularly when they're only in position for 2, 3 years. And we're losing so much time democratically. And it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, whoever it is that the public elect, they should be equipped to do their job. That's what it's about. And then they can hopefully deliver more effective policy more quickly and more readily.
totally
I
agree.
don't see how we can solve the wicked problems of climate change, immigration, the broken ladder of opportunity or anything, and cost of living issues, housing, unless we've got people who at the top who are supported to do their job well.
Yeah, and have the sort of want to stay in the roles for a long time and have the ability to stay in the roles for a long
Yeah.
time, and so develop the specialism and and make it count. Yeah, I completely agree. So let's move on to advertising, which is obviously the element of the political marketing matrix, which is particularly dear to me. Um, Thinking about market orientation, returning to that sort of concept, how should a party's market orientation impact a party's advertising strategy?
So good question. There was an academic in New Zealand called Claire Robinson who looked at this and said that generally, the communication should reflect the market orientation. So it should be about the voters, it should be about the key products that have been offered. Obviously, it shouldn't talk down to voters. It shouldn't just spend lots of time criticizing and the other parties. It should be really, it's the final chance to sell something that hopefully the voters are already thinking of purchasing or voting for, supporting. And it should be, the final sale that just reminds them of the benefits of that product. So they should be targeted on, the voters who they're trying to reach and the products that they've got designed to them. Shouldn't be going after everybody. The market should be segmented in that respect. But I don't think your chapter found that, though, did it? I think it found that actually they weren't very targeted.
Particularly on the Labour side, they were very broadly targeted. They were targeted geographically, but they weren't segmenting into specific voter groups very much at all. And I think that it's interesting because that plays into the policy agenda, which was very broad strokes and was designed for everyone. And then the paid media approach again was sort of very, very broad. And it's interesting that they had a conversion problem off the back of it. So, yeah, I mean, they had a really tricky problem. They had such a huge number of people considering them. They wanted to speak to as many of those people as possible. And to do that and make the budget work for that, you sort of necessarily have to be quite broad. I think if we were to rerun the 24 election and I was to be able to, give Labour some Back to the Future style advice, I think going a bit a bit deeper on some policies which were particularly salient for smaller segments, and spending that extra bit of money on targeting to make sure those policies landed with those segments, I think would be worth its weight in gold. But on the other hand, I think the Conservatives were very targeted, and I think they had a really clear view of the relatively small number of people who were considering voting for them and what they were worried about, and they were very focused on it. And I think then again you saw in their conversion rate that they were more efficient. So the Conservatives' problem was that there was just not enough people who were thinking that they would consider voting Conservative, but they actually did a pretty good job of those who were considering them, getting them over the line.
Right. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you could always say, oh, well, it's not Labour's fault. There were too many people who they had to consider. But actually, marketing suggests you do need to consider who are you actually going to go after, not go after everybody. Focus your resources, go on the ones that are most persuadable, and really think about that relationship between what you're offering and what they want and need. And I just felt there was definitely something missing, particularly in the campaign. Now, of course, we should add, we can be empathetic to Labour and their strategists and their marketers by saying, well, the election was brought forward, 3-4 months, and that would have derailed things. And it could, because you remember the First Steps ad that they launched just before the election date was brought forward and started. That maybe was and it had six steps, wasn't it? And they did have something on immigration in there, so they were starting to pick that up and respond to it. And it could be they had a whole series of things planned to build on that. And then the election was brought forward, and it's almost like they went, oh, let's just talk about change, nothing else, and just hope we get enough voters.
But it's interesting, isn't it, looking at those 6 steps, they were sort of, no one could disagree with them, could they? And that you might look at that and go, great, we've got a brilliant set of 6 steps there. But I think in some ways, strategy is sacrifice, and you kind of need a few in there which people go, either yes, I really want that, that is particularly for me, and some people go, no, actually I disagree with that. And I think probably by being so broad that everyone agreed with it, I get why they did it, because they had this vast array of people considering them. You don't want to put anyone off. But on the other hand, they had fewer people who were, absolutely desperate for some particular offering that was designed for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really interesting dilemma they had.
And instead, it's like they were saying, look, vote for us because we're not the other people who are really, really bad. We're not going to tell you what it is we're going to give you, but, at least we're not the other people who are really, really bad. And just remember, we're not the other people who are really, really bad. And that was it. And it's like, so it wasn't inspiring. It didn't, no wonder it give people hope. No wonder nobody had any faith that they could actually do anything. And so it means they've come into government at a really, really low level. And we've seen the impact of that already, where their support is plummeting to below, not just that of the Conservatives, but Reform specifically. It's a real shame. It's a real missed opportunity.
I do wonder if they have learned the lesson, because it seems to me like they're, in the last few months, they are being much more focused on a particular type of voter.
Maybe.
And they are certainly doing things which some voters will find sort of unappealing. And so, yeah, I wonder if they have learned the lesson. And you just have to look at the conversion rate of, they're never going to have 70% of people considering them next time round. And so if they keep the same conversion rate as they did this time round, then they're going to lose. They won't get a majority.
No.
And so they need to significantly increase their conversion rate on a smaller consideration rate. And to do that, you need to have a much deeper connection with probably a sort of a smaller group of people.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing signs that they're moving in that direction. I must say, I don't have any internal sort of intel that is the case, but that is my view on what they're trying to do, which seems sensible to me. So finally, let's. I guess I've sort of given my view on a lesson that I've learned from 2024 and what I would do if I was the Labour Party. Be a little bit focused on going a bit deeper on some segments. But was there any single lesson that stood out for you, which, if you were sat in a room now with the people who are going to be leading the general election campaigns, or not even the campaigns, the marketing, from here until the next general election, what would be your sort of single takeaway from 2024 that you think they should take note of for next time?
It would be don't forget the product and that you have to deliver it. So with Labour, they really need to redefine what it is they're doing, what they're focusing on, then actually deliver it, and then make sure people understand that. With the other parties, again, I mean, the Conservatives, they should leave the leader alone and realise they've got a major brand problem now, and they need to focus again on why they got it wrong and what voters didn't want from them and what they do. But it really is remembering that it's political marketing is supposed to be about the product. Everybody talks about the comms, but it's actually supposed to be about the product. But designing it to suit voters' wants and needs, but also delivering it. And that sounds so simple, and you'd be like, oh, well, yeah, but they weren't very good at it in 24. They were terrible, which is why you get this space for people like Nigel Farage and leader of the Reform Party to get traction, because they're speaking in plain language about the concerns that people strongly have. The same second thing, I'm not saying it's good policy-wise or anything like that, but I'm just saying, explaining that's why they're picking up support, because people then at least feel they're heard. Even if they don't like what they hear, they feel that they're being listened to. The other thing is the immigration issue, which I don't think is just immigration. I think it is about this sense of security and opportunity, that people feel that they're not in a secure position and that their children won't have the same opportunities that they did. And possibly not just that they're not going to be wealthy, but actually it's not just about wealth and growth, but there's something else, a quality of life that is slipping away, that needs to come back, even if it's in a new form. And from the left-wing perspective, in particular, if you were advising the Labour Party, it would be to think about that, and I think about working class voters, or certainly very much low income middle class voters, because they're the ones who seem to have been forgotten. Tony Blair onwards, put them to the side because they weren't enough to win a majority. And I understand they're not enough to win a majority, but they are a key part of society that is doing it tough, and that parties like Labour and the Democrats in the US should be in tune with, should be understanding, and should be able to gain support from, and with new policies. But it's not happening at the moment, and there's a big gap there for left-wing parties to take the opportunity. Otherwise, as Tim Walz, who was vice presidential candidate in the US election under Kamala Harris, said, otherwise Trump is going to be appealing. Trump type voters are going to appeal to them, and we can see that happening with reform here now. So they really do need to get out there and get their listening ears out and understand what is going on, and that people are not doing so well as they were, not just economically, but in a security sense, in terms of stability for their lives and ability to get ahead. And there's things going wrong in lots of different parts of life, and they need to understand that. And I suppose for the Conservatives, it's an opportunity, if they could be smart and wise enough to do that, but it would require a lot of agility on their part and new thinking on their part to do that. But it has happened before. Thatcher's proof of that. The revolutions kind of happened. But it would be a big ask.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating perspective, and why I love reading your material, and why it's been so great to talk to you today is, I think so often when people think of political marketing, they think basically of communication, and they're thinking about press releases and social media ads and that sort of thing. But the way you explain it is, it's so much more than that. It's about your audience. It's about the product. It's about the party brand, the leader brand. You bring so many different elements into it, and in some ways you realize how much more complex it is.
Yeah.
But you always explain it so simply. So thanks so much for coming on the show today, and for all of your work generally. The political community thanks you for it. Political marketing and management in the 2024 UK election is coming out in late July, but it's available to pre-order now. So get your copy, and you can read all of Jennifer's writing, a little bit of mine, and some other amazing chapters. That's all we've got time for today, but do subscribe, and you'll catch our next episode very soon. Thank you very much, Jennifer. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Pleasure.